582 attempts at the 16-star speedrun of Super Mario 64, and I had taken my personal best time down from 20 minutes and 20 seconds to 20 minutes and 18 seconds. 200 runs attempted in order to save 2 whole seconds. The excitement and frustration I was feeling at this moment was palpable, and I began to genuinely consider if all of this was actually worth it. With all the improvements I had made up to this point, the first half of the run was becoming increasingly consistent, which turned out to be a double-edged sword. The second half of the 16-star run is, for lack of a better term, a PB black hole. It's a speedrun vortex. Nearly every run was making it to the second half, and this became not only where most of my runs lived, but where pretty much all of my runs died. Leaving Bowser in the Dark World was the metaphorical event horizon, at which point all of my 16-star hopes and dreams would pass, only to be crushed by their own gravity into oblivion. But alas, I soldiered on. There was more to learn, more to refine, more to improve. It was going to take even more next-level dedication to achieve my goal. The first step to kickstarting my final push towards my modest version of SM64 speedrun greatness came from investing the time to learn and understand one of the most important tools I had at my disposal. My speedrun timer, a program called LiveSplit. There are a number of fairly popular features in LiveSplit that some speedrunners take advantage of that I had seen before but never really quite understood the utility of, as well as a few other features that were in front of me all along that I didn't even know existed. Learning what these things meant made both running and spectating other speedrunners so much more of a richer experience. Now, I briefly discussed the more obvious high-level features of LiveSplit in my first Ocarina of Time speedrunning video, which included discussions of what splits are, what the personal best column is, split deltas, and what each of their colors signify, and your sum of best time. Now, these features are the common starting point for many runners, but there's quite a bit more I hadn't known about until recently. Let's start with best possible time. Now, as you know, your PB time is the best time that you've ever achieved in a single run, and your sum of best is your theoretical current best time comprised of all of your individual segment personal bests. Now, these are all interesting as reference values, but they have slightly less utility during a run itself, given that they're static. They don't change throughout a run. They don't really tell you anything in particular that you can use as a runner, as a tool, to gauge the viability of your current run. As you progress through your runs, slowly optimizing different elements along the way, the frequency of times that you get golds decrease quite rapidly until you eventually hit a point where you can't improve your segment times any further with your current strategies. Theoretically, your personal sum of best should always be slowly approaching the theoretically perfect possible time given your route, which you could think of as the ultimate goal of any speedrunner's attempts. Your route can be represented as a conceptual perfect run, the time that you could achieve if you did everything you wanted to perfectly. Your sum of best time is an approximation of this perfect theoretical run. It's as close as you could possibly come to your personal perfection given how you performed before. Now, your actual PB is kind of like an approximation of your sum of best. It's the best actual time you've performed in a single run. It may or may not include one or more of your personal best segment times, but unless you're either just starting out or one of the top runners that's heavily optimized your route, these numbers are usually fairly far apart. Now, every run that you're currently doing you can think of as some approximation of your personal best. You're always racing against your best attempt at achieving your personal realistic version of some theoretical perfection. Now, this is where the best possible time value comes in handy. Best possible time is effectively a combination between your current run's pace and your sum of best. What it tells you is, if I were to play at my personal best from now until the end of the run, what would my time be? It gives you a realistic idea for the best possible time you could expect to get if you clutched the remainder of your run. Now, note that given this definition, it is possible to end up with a time that's faster than your best possible time, but that would involve improving on one or more of your personal best split times. You'd essentially have to get at least one gold. The next useful metric I learned is known as your possible time save. Now this time is specific to the current segment of your run and is determined by finding the difference between your time for this segment on your PB run compared to your best ever time for this segment. Now if you happen to have gotten a gold split during your previous PB, then there's going to be no possible time save. Whereas if you did poorly on that segment during your PB, then this value can be quite significant. What this number tells us is probably one of the most important things to know at any given time in a run. How much time do I stand to gain right now? Now, of course, it goes without saying, it's possible for you to pop off and get a new crazy, incredible speed gold on this segment and save more time than it says was technically possible, but this is definitely the exception to the rule. Whenever you see a decently large time shown for the possible time save, this is where a runner knows that they can either make up for lost time if they made previous mistakes on their current run, or perhaps put themselves even further ahead if they're on good pace already. More often than not, if you're on a run where you're behind on your PB by some time, if you come up to a split and see that the possible time save is larger than your current time loss, if you focus hard and clutch the split, this can put you back in the green. Now, the final piece of useful information that took me way longer to learn than it should have is the significance of when exactly the delta time for each segment is displayed. Now, this isn't arbitrary as I once thought. It actually tells you when you've missed your opportunity for a gold split. Now, if you split before this number pops up, unless you literally split at the exact moment, fraction of a second where you golded last time, you will get a gold on this current segment. This is actually super helpful as you approach the end of each segment. If you're behind your gold split time, the delta time popping up is functionally equivalent to a ghost, giving you a visual indication of how far behind your gold split time you are, whereas the actual number that's displayed and is counting up gives you an indication of how far you are ahead or behind of your overall PB time. This is really cool. These two things combined give you two different frames of reference for how you're doing both in the run overall as well as on the current segment. As soon as you see that delta time pop up, that's basically like seeing your segment gold time cross the finish line just before you. The optimization of the remainder of the run began with a bombshell discovery, one that touched on one of the mechanics I mentioned in the first episode of this series: saving the game. Now note that the save file does not have anything saved on it. It always needs to be a fresh game. This is the first of two reasons why we want to avoid saving the game during the speedrun. It's simply easier and more convenient to start and restart runs when the file is fresh. Now finally, 3 episodes later, I'll be sharing the second reason for avoiding saving the game, and the literal game-changing trick I learned to make it pretty much foolproof. Now, not only does saving the game after each star make resets between runs more time-consuming, but if you're playing on a Nintendo 64, and I think to a smaller degree on emulator, it actually slows down your current run. It takes a few more frames every time to make the selection to have the game save and then dismiss the menu than it does if you're able to select continue without saving. This, of course, assumes that you're able to select continue without saving quickly enough. So then, what's the bombshell? For starters, the extra work it takes to scroll down twice to select continue and save for every star in the run hardly feels worth the few frames of time save it buys you, especially when you consider the risk that it introduces, accidentally selecting the second option in the list, save and quit, which effectively kills your run. Now, I didn't make this mistake too often, but one particularly frustrating day had 3 such occurrences nearly back to back, which brought me to my breaking point. I was either going to find a reliable way to avoid this mistake, or I was going to abandon this small time-saving but ultimately risky strategy altogether. When I was analyzing top runners in this and other similar categories, I noticed that their menu navigation and selection was insanely fast. I decided to look into what they were doing to achieve this seemingly inhuman speed and precision. Here I'll show a clip from a recent run by Kanno, that as of a few days ago was the new 16-star world record. Did you catch that? Let's look at it one more time. Let's look at another one, but this time pay attention to what he does during the star select menu. Were you able to catch what he did? Now what he's doing is subtle but significant. Pay attention to the star he selects. Now in most cases, the star you select doesn't really matter. You can pretty much collect any star at any time. It's important to note though that the default star that's selected is the first star that you haven't collected yet. In this case, should be star number 2, the blue star. Now you might have noticed a little menu sound indicating that he had pressed left on the analog stick, which changed from the default star of 2 to the first star. So why would he go out of his way to select the first star, one he's already collected? The selection of the star actually is completely irrelevant. What is relevant is the controller input on this screen. Here's some of my gameplay I just recorded demonstrating this. Take a look at the lower left-hand corner. You can see the input display, showing the buttons I'm pressing and those 2 little O's representing the control stick input. Here's what happens if I enter a stage without touching the controller at all, where I've collected the first star but not the second star. As you can see, I wasn't pressing the analog stick, so nothing happened, there was no sound that was played, and the second star is the one that's automatically selected by default. What happens now if I hold left on the analog stick as I enter the level? Alright, so that matches exactly what we saw Kanno do. In order to understand why, we need to learn a little bit about menus. And there are 4 major types of menus you're going to find yourself navigating during an SM64 speedrun. If you pause the game, there's of course the pause menu. As soon as you enter a stage, you're presented with the star select menu. There are a few times where certain dialog boxes pop up, and then at the end, you're given the option to select one or more options, such as when you're given a star from Toad outside of Hazy Maze Cave. And finally, after you collect a star or a key inside of a level, you're taken back out into the castle and presented with the save options. Now let me first explain how these menus behave, and then I'll get into how we, as speedrunners, can take advantage of this implementation. As soon as one of these menus pops up and you try scrolling between the different options as fast as you can, you'll notice that there's something throttling the movement between the options. You can't simply scroll as fast as you'd like. Now this is of course something common in lots of games, especially games with a controller and an analog stick, in an attempt to make navigating the menus more user-friendly. If the options changed as fast as possible, which presumably would be once per frame, it would be very hard to select the intended option, as each option would be selected for only 1/30th of a second, so navigating one menu option up or down or left or right would have to be frame perfect. This would be of course ridiculous. Now the same sort of user experience focused thinking is presumably what led to the designers making menus not wrap around, such as when pressing down while on the bottom option of a vertical menu, the current selection would wrap around back to the top. Throttling the menu navigation and not enabling wrapping were both likely conscious design decisions to help prevent frustrating accidental menu selections for the average normal player. Now lastly, many menus are preceded by little mini cutscenes or animations. For example, after you collect a star inside of a level, the player loses control over Mario. There's a little cutscene that shows him celebrating, then he returns back to the castle from the level entrance, and you are presented with a menu asking if you want to save and continue, save and quit, or continue without saving. The underlying code controls how long it should take for the menu to appear after the animation begins, as well as how long until the player is able to take control of the game again to be able to interact with the menu. What's most noteworthy about these menus is that they all share the same underlying implementation that handles scrolling and throttling between options in the menu. There's essentially one shared entity common for all the menus, and this entity uses what is effectively a timer that's responsible for controlling how fast a player can scroll between each option. This timer is just an integer that starts with a value of 0, and as soon as you attempt to scroll within a menu, the timer begins ticking up, incrementing 1 for every frame that you're attempting to scroll until it hits 10, at which point the menu is allowed to scroll to the next option, and the timer resets to one of 2 different values. At this point, if you're no longer attempting to scroll, which means your analog stick is basically in the neutral position, the timer is reset back to 0. But if you're still actively attempting to scroll, which means you're holding the analog stick in the direction you're scrolling, the timer is instead set to a value of 8. Now this results in a few important in-game behaviors. And when you first enter a level, you're presented with the star select screen. As long as you're holding either left or right on the analog stick, the screen considers you scrolling. So the timer ticks up, reaches 10, and then will constantly loop between 8 and 10 for as long as you're holding the stick. Now if while holding the stick you select the star, the current timer value is persisted, which in this case will be either 8, 9, or 10, which will come in handy in just a bit. As soon as you collect the star and leave the level, the Save Options menu is presented after a celebratory animation is shown. The code responsible for rendering the Save Options menu does a few things here. First, it begins in a state of opening, which continues for 100 frames, at which point it then transitions to being displayed normally as a vertical options menu, and then it waits until the timer hits 110 to start handling user input. Now, this means any button presses like A or B are effectively ignored before the timer hits 110. And given that it takes 100 frames for the animation to occur and the dialogue to pop up, that means that option selection is prevented for the first 10 frames after they appear. I can't overstate just how convenient this accidental state of affairs is for speedrunners. As long as you are holding either left and right during star selection, this means that the scrolling timer will have one of three values, 8, 9, or 10. So what ends up happening here is the process of displaying the save option starts, which takes 100 frames. Then from here, it takes 10 frames to fully display the options menu, but our scrolling timer starting at 8, 9, or 10 gets a head start, so we can already start scrolling before this menu is even done being displayed. Now while we get a head start on scrolling, we don't get a head start on button inputs, which is actually kind of nice. This means that if we simply hold down on the analog stick and basically mash the A button, we're effectively guaranteed to select the third option, continue, don't save. The A button mashing is going to be ignored for 10 frames, but the scrolling that we initiate by holding the stick down is guaranteed to finish before those 10 frames are up. All of this means that we basically have a method to do the continue without save that's easy, consistent, and most importantly, as close as we can get to being risk-free. This would get me through the next 400 or so runs, not only without making the mistake of saving and quitting and killing a run, but more importantly, without having to stress about it ever again. The weeks of running SM64 that would follow this discovery would be a tough grind. I spent countless hours practicing, optimizing my movement, and making each of the little details along the way just a little bit better. You can see from these side-by-side comparisons that not only are my new strategies faster, but they're so much more consistent. All of that practice, all of that grinding, 300 attempted runs led up to this moment. Run 718. Was this going to be my sub 20?